Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Kia from Malaysia. I work with a social development agency in Malaysia called Malaysian Care. I missed all of you the first time because I was at the village working with the indigenous people. We are working on advocacy for their land rights.
Good.
So, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good, thanks. I caught up on the video just now and caught up on all the readings.
Wonderful. Great. I think let's see. We've had a couple more people joining. Craig, welcome. Cheryl and Kingdom Networker. Was that a Stephen?
Yes, that's Stephen Owino, Kingdom Networker. Stephen Owino from Tanzania.
Right, excellent. Well, welcome everybody. So why don't we start with a prayer and then we'll just jump in. So let's pray. We give you thanks, Father, for this new opportunity to connect from such diverse places in your creation. We commit this time to you so that we may learn together, we may come to a deeper sense of discipleship. And we pray that out of this course, you will give us new commitment for your mission and new passion for holistic discipleship. In Jesus' name, amen. Great, wonderful. Welcome, Norman. I was proposing to start today's session with the anti-decalogue, the exercise in the forum that we had. And the purpose of that exercise was to actually, by means of contradicting it or argue, saying something to deconstruct it, or to oppose it, to try to understand what the commandments were saying to the people of God, and try to say it in a way that is relevant for our time. So I was going to ask Carla if she could share the slides of some of the anti-commandments that you all wrote. I think you had. You showed me another slide where they were in a bigger. Okay. Well, sorry, technical difficulty there.
Can I just say, while you're getting that sorted out, I thought it was a very good idea. I quite enjoyed reading the ones that contributed. Thank you to those who came up with some creative ideas for anti-commandments. I thought it was a neat idea.
Thanks. As we wait for them to appear on the screen, does anybody else want to say something about that exercise, or how it made them think about the commandments? Well, it looks like Carla is.
There we are.
Okay, let's see that. I'm just going to make my screen bigger so that we can read it. The first one, since I think everybody that's written them is here except Ruth Borges. I'm going to ask each person who has written the commandment to just read it out loud, and we can respond to it. So Stan, you're first.
Yeah. I just wanted to put a spin on God's name and not misusing it, respecting the name of God. And if we put ourselves in God's place, whatever the way that might be, then that means that we rise to the top there. So that's what I was just trying to get through there. What we hear a lot in Western societies: stand up for yourself, make your name top of the world, the most important one in your life. So that's what I was getting at there.
Thank you, Stan. So the anti-commandment itself reads, don't let anyone put you down. You must rise to the top in all situations. Stand up for yourself whenever anyone belittles you or demeans you. Your name must be respected by all. And of course, we know that the people that were building the Tower of Babel, they wanted to make their name great, right? And thank you. I think it's a good way to understand the commandment today. Tim.
Hi, good morning. Do you want me to read it?
Yes, please.
You shall make for yourselves various images in the form of anything above or below. You shall bow down to them and worship them, for I am one of many gods, indifferent to how you carry on your lives. Therefore, seek out idols who will give you your covetous desires in exchange for a life of bondage to them. And so there I was kind of getting at the idea we talked about, that God wasn't just a liberator who sent Israel on their way, but he brought them to Sinai, and the idea was that he would build a relationship with them and seek to dwell among them.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tim. That commandment is particularly, or the way you wrote it, the anti-commandment is particularly relevant. I was just thinking for my life, what if God would allow me to bow down to the things that I want to worship or I want to commit my life and efforts to? Where would I be, right? So thanks.
I like the fact, Tim, that you have God saying, I'm one of many gods and I'm indifferent to how you carry on your life, because I do think that's at the root of a lot of contemporary idolatry, is that even those who might believe that there is a God of some sort don't believe in a God who actually is interested in how we carry on our life and who requires us to worship him alone. So that element of God being indifferent, I'm just one of many gods, that is, I think, very common even among Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ruth is not here yet, is she? Well, I'm going to read it out loud. You may rest and take a day out. However, someone, or some among you, I guess, for instance, your household, employees, need to be there for you, so your rest experience is complete. I found this so poignant. I don't know who else wants to react to it, but I just, who wants to take a shot at it?
I really enjoyed this one. I grew up in a family that had a really strict Sabbath keeping practice, and we wouldn't even go out to eat because it meant that somebody was having to work on Sunday. And I thought it was ridiculous. I thought it was really legalistic. But there's something about it, about this idea of who is working so that I can rest. And so I really liked this one.
Go ahead.
I just find this one very helpful. I was wanted to say that in my comment because it picks up also something that David, you yourself said in your little speech, the video that you did on the fourth commandment. as you may know from my CV, that my wife and I lived in India for about 5 years. Having come, just like Rachel, from a fairly Sabbatarian kind of background in Northern Ireland, where exactly the same thing applied, the rule seemed to be you were allowed to do anything on Sunday except if you enjoyed it. And anything that was enjoyable or fun was wrong. So going to India, the question was, what do we do with the lady who helped in our home? She was in Indian terms a servant, and most of the servants on the campus in the seminary where I was working were basically 7 days a week. They worked every day, but we insisted that this lady should not come in on Sunday, because we felt, well, that's an application of the fourth commandment, not because we're being legalistic, but because we want to feel, if God said that the Sabbath was for the benefit of those who are workers, working servants, animals, and everything, then we should make sure that the person who worked for us had a day of rest as well. So that's what really hit me, and so I think Ruth there is exactly right.
Thank you, Guy. It brings in the justice aspect of Sabbath keeping so well, right? The next one, coveting. Rachel.
I wrote, make sure to check your Facebook daily so you don't miss any trends. And so you can post a photo, a comment, or an article that makes you look more attractive, intelligent, fashionable, committed to a cause, and happy than everyone else.
Do tell us more, please.
I think just coveting in the modern world is so easy, and we're all basically about trying to essentially make other people covet us through our use of social media. And I think one of the things I was trying to get at there is it's not just maybe kind of old school coveting of who has a bigger house or who has more disposable income to consume with, but I think we're even trying to as we manage our images, I think we're trying to look more social justice-y or more whatever it is that you value. We're trying to make sure that we look enough like that in the way we portray ourselves, specifically via social media. So I think there's a lot of ways you could have taken this one, because I think you could talk about marketing and consumerism and stuff, but I think social media is one interesting aspect of this in today's world.
Yeah, someone else says something. I do want to respond so much to this, but I'll allow someone else to jump into this anti-commandment.
I'm really struck by that idea that Rachel said, more than was written here, about the sort of whole sort of frame of social media is to create coveting. That really does resonate, and so as a sort of anti-decalogue, this is, I'm going to sit and chew on that for a little while, and not check my Facebook while I'm on this call.
This is amazing. Thank you for sharing this. This really gets at the mundane everydayness of coveting. Thank you.
Yeah, I have commented on this one as well. I felt that coveting it stems from a deep-rooted discontentment, that we have this restlessness in our hearts. That's why there's this coveting. Especially when we look at friends on Facebook, if they're on holiday or they have a good time, and then we feel bad for ourselves.
Yeah, it's interesting that when you ask people to define what is success, people hesitate, because I know that people will say, well, success is that I have my own house, my own car, my own I'm independent and I can pay my own way and also have a holiday, etc., etc. And I think at the heart of that, we've never defined what is success or what is enough. You know, when we try and say what is sufficiency, what is enough salary, because the whole of the messaging of our world and our society and social media always says you can have more, and of course that it adds, and you're worth it.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to, everyone, we are going to talk about the Cape Town Commitment document and the call for the church for simplicity and humility. And this coveting, this anti-commandment of coveting is again so poignant, I think, for us Christians. You know, a lot of my contacts are Christians, and I myself tend to post things about ministry and success in ministry, or you know, we just like to portray ourselves as I don't know, this wonderful teachers or preachers or scholars or social justice workers or anything, right? Which there is some truth to that, I guess. But when we embrace the framework of social media to talk about that and to portray our success or life in that platform, I guess it does lead to covetousness. And we'll talk more. We'll talk about the Cape Town Commitment document and the call for the church. So thank you, Rich. Next, we have a Stephen, treatment of your neighbor. Stephen. Okay, I'm just going to read it out loud. Feel free to mistreat your neighbor, since he or she is not from your ethnic or clan context, or even of your religious, social, or political affiliation. Spread bad news about them, and whenever possible, seek for ways to ensure that they are denied through justice in order for you to feel good about it. Anyone wants to respond to that?
I mean, that is a real big issue in parts of Africa that Stephen's highlighted. Stephen and I were just in Rwanda, actually, and we were listening to some of the people who survived genocide, some of the stories that they were telling. And some of the stories were that the grandmother had told the son, her grandson, every day how bad the neighbors were because they were from a different ethnic group. And actually that person had later become one of the people who killed. And he traced back his pain and hatred because of these constant messages that the neighbors were no good. So I think that's also some of the where Stephen's coming from.
Have we lost David? I can't see him at the moment. I'm just wondering if he's been cut off.
Yeah, probably, but we can continue. I don't know if anybody else have other response to Stephen's comment.
I think it's
Sorry, I don't know
pretty.
where I left off, but I'm back. I'm sorry.
Oh, good, good. Yeah.
Did I interrupt anybody? Sorry, keep going.
No, we were just waiting for you to come back, David.
Okay, thanks. I'm sure what was said was wonderful. I'm not going to ask you to repeat it because it's recorded, so I can watch it. You wrote something in the chat.
Yeah, I just added mine. I added it quite late, so it's not here on the list. Maybe I just read it out.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote here, forget your parents. It's on the commandment number 5. You don't have to remember your parents and look into their needs, for they owe it to you to feed and clothe you. Take care of yourselves first, and you will be blessed with all creature comfort to make a good life. I think for us Asian, it is our teaching to honor our parents. But more and more nowadays that because of the way we pursue life, a lot of us are forgetting to take care of our parents. And actually, I don't understand how the commandment that come with a blessing, that we may live long in the land that God is giving us, how does it relate to honoring our parents?
Chris?
Yes, I think I was going to say, read my commentary on Deuteronomy. Forget the phone that's ringing there for the moment. It's to do with the fact that ownership of the land and membership of an Israelite family were very important in Old Testament Israel. And anything that threatens the integrity of the family. Excuse me, I'm just going to go and have to deal with something outside our front door that my wife's drawing attention to. Yeah. Hello.
I see that Ruth has arrived finally. Welcome,
Yes.
Ruth.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm late.
That's okay. It's wonderful to see you.
Yeah.
And Cheryl is going to share something too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So we'll wait for Chris to come back.
Yes.
And we appreciated your anti-commandment about Sabbath.
Yeah, and this exercise was really something that I couldn't expect when I read it, but reading other people's responses and also when I thought about it, it's something so common, something we do all the time. I mean, it's so daily life, all the comments I read, and it really made alive the Bible. I mean, sometimes I think, well, the 10 Commandments, the 10 Commandments, okay, blah, 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 but they are so alive when we go in the other direction that well, I'm still processing all this.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think that was a common experience for a number of us during this exercise. While we wait for Chris to come back for to answer Kia's question, I think we can go to Cheryl's anti-commandment, which she wrote on the chat.
Yeah, I just wrote it maybe too late on the main discussion board. But what I was writing was on adultery, and what I wrote is this: being with this person makes me happy, so it can't be wrong. Surely we are all entitled to happiness. As one of the often reasons why people justify having an affair or a relationship outside of marriage. And it was interesting, we were discussing the whole issue of polygamy in Africa this last few weeks. And one of the comments that really gripped my attention was something that Johannes Reimer said. And he said, you know, we always point the finger at Africa about polygamy, having a number of wives. but in the West, we tend to have chronological polygamy. So he says it's still a form of polygamy because it just happens one after the other. But it was an interesting way he said that. I thought I'd just share that with you all. But most people will talk about happiness as being the real motivator for justification of any kind of affair.
Wow, you just blew my mind. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. Chris, welcome back. You were answering Kia's
yeah, there was something going on outside our front door. It's interesting that living here in central London, we have sometimes disturbances, and in fact, there's a girl out there who's clearly on drugs, I think. But she had a rather fierce-looking dog as well. So I wasn't. Anyway, I think she'll probably have moved on by the time this is over. But we have that. We have sometimes homeless people in the doorways. So the social issues of London are, in a sense, literally on our doorstep sometimes. So, but thank you for back. Yeah, and also it was because my wife had gone out and she'd gone through all this, and so she was just ringing back to see if I was aware of it and was I going to sort of do anything about it. So she was a little bit afraid, but she's now off shopping.
Oh, right. I'm glad everything's okay. So you were telling us about your commentary on Deuteronomy and the issue of parents.
Yes, I was just saying on the fifth commandment, and indeed on all of Old Testament law, we need to remember the importance of kinship and land, which of course is true for many non-Western societies. I mean, it's a very traditional thing that to belong to a family and to have possession of something of the tribal or clan or family inheritance is almost essential in order to belong to the community. And in Israel, the covenant relationship with God in Old Testament Israel is, in a sense, vested within the network of Israelite households on the land. So whatever threatens the integrity of marriage, hence the laws against adultery, or the integrity of parent-child relationships, either by children dishonoring parents or parents abusing children and selling daughters into prostitution, for example. This integrity and balance of the family is very important in Old Testament law in order for their continued well-being as a community in God's land. So I think that's part of the rationale for that commandment having that particular motivation clause in it.
Thank you, Chris. Was there any responses to that?
In regards to what Chris said?
Yeah, that's honoring parents, or the previous one about adultery.
What I'm thinking, the strong relationship between land and kingship, between family and the ability to have the means of production for their own sustenance and daily living. I think that it's central, and many have seen the parallelism with the possibility of people having employment or having access to means of production in a capitalistic world in which many are either unemployed and in the ranks of the unemployed, or in the ranks of the excluded and marginalized, or even in the ranks of the employed but low salaries. The reality of the third world and poverty is central, and that's a big thing that sounds in my head when I heard what Chris was saying, the possibility of having one's own food production and one's own ability to have life and dignity. In the Old Testament, the image of the widow and the orphan were the people that were separated from the possibility of having that land, and therefore there was a special care about them because they weren't the head of the family, because they weren't male and they didn't have that figure in their families, and therefore the widows and the orphans occupied a central relationship. And I think that today the equivalent would be something like the people that don't have that access to what the parallel of land would be in our days.
I think you're exactly right, Andrew. And it's interesting, it's not just the widow and the orphan who were basically familyless and deprived of land, but also the foreigner who had no share in the land, and the Levite whose tribe did not have the means of production. They were dependent on the gifts of the people. Interestingly, you may have read the little section in my book, The Mission of God's People, on the Jubilee. And the interesting thing about the Jubilee law was that it was a way of restoring economic participation to families. It wasn't just charitable handouts. It was to restore to people the capacity to farm and to earn and to produce for themselves. And you're right, in a society which is not necessarily agricultural any longer, in other words, in post-industrial societies, we have to think creatively as to what would take the place in an industrial society where people don't have ownership of land and farm for themselves. What are the opportunistic realities that people have? Education, for example, is an important ability. If you know education or low literacy, your participation in the economic project is very limited. So we can think of land and kinship in Old Testament terms, but we don't have to, as it were, translate it literalistically into a modern society, but ask, what did that represent for an Israelite and their family, and what would be the equivalent things in today's society? And by the way, Andrew, you're making me break the 10th commandment, because I think you're having a lovely sip on yerba mate. Is that right? Yeah, I can see it. I'd love to go up and get mine down from the kitchen and have a sip of that. Keeps you going.
It does. So, well, let's continue. It's been a wonderful exercise. And for those of you who haven't written your anti-commandments, we'll keep the course open until the 12th, so you can participate with your own anti-commandments. I wanted to continue last week's conversation. We left one question hanging, and just wanted to read it out loud for you. I put it in the chat there, but this question to Chris, from the perspective of a seasoned Old Testament scholar, how should the understanding of redemptive discipleship in the context of the book of Exodus be strategically and effectively spread down to the grassroots church setting in order for the wider Christian community to be able to benefit from it? In the context of the church in Africa, there is always a strong emphasis on preaching from the Old Testament to a great extent, but the proper interpretation is always lacking, to an extent that some of the Old Testament biblical imageries and analogies tend to be treated literally.
Yeah, thank you. We did finish last week's discussion saying we'd pick this up, and I'm really obviously going to more address the first half of that post rather than the African church reality, which of course is very true. But the question basically is, how might I suggest that we can get this redemptive discipleship down to grassroots church level? And by redemptive discipleship, I think we are recalling that part of the chapter of my book which spoke about the 4 dimensions of the redemptive work of God in the Exodus, matching up to 4 dimensions of the brokenness and bondage that was the reality for the Hebrews in Egypt. And what I would suggest is that a church could do an Exodus audit of itself and its neighborhood, and do it quite seriously and quite with some research. Ask questions about what are the dimensions of brokenness or bondage that we see in our surrounding neighborhood, or not necessarily the whole country, but just the local church community. There will be some obvious ones. I mean, there will be economic areas where some, at least undoubtedly in almost every community in the world, there will be those who are poor or in need of some sort materially, and ask the question, why is that so? And how can we respond to that? But that will also then raise other areas of social. Remember, we thought there was economic, social, political, and spiritual dimensions to the Exodus. So in the social area of the community, where is there brokenness? Is in families, in educational terms, in unemployment, in the kind of things that cause fractures within community, gang warfare, violence. There's all sorts of social areas that one could look at and say, what is happening and why is it happening? And then, of course, there's obviously the political dimension, because one would want to ask, why isn't somebody doing something about this? And who has the authority to do anything about this? Who has responsibility to be doing something about these things? So is there a role for the church in any kind of advocating for justice or seeking justice with the relevant political authorities? But not neglecting the fourth area that was there in the book, that is the spiritual dimension. Because all human beings, no matter what their social, economic, and political disabilities and brokenness, also need to hear the good news of what God has done for them through the Lord Jesus Christ, and particularly the world-changing reality of the cross of Christ, the crucifixion, and his resurrection. So where are the spiritual needs of people? Where can they be met? How can people hear that good news? How can the church then, what I'm saying is, how can the church be a redemptive presence in their community in all of those areas, and thereby embodying the holistic gospel? So we're using the Exodus then not in the sense of believing that we can just march in like, as it were, like Moses, and say, let my people go and do a big exodus out of the community and take them off to some other promised land. It's asking, what are the dimensions of the Exodus that we could then seek to observe and identify in a local community, and then work out gospel-centered but holistic and biblically rooted responses as a church, as a Christian community. I think that's what I would recommend the church might do.
Thank you, Chris. Two things. Andrew wanted to ask a question, and then Stephen wanted to show appreciation for the manuscript, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But Cheryl also wants to ask a question. So feel free. This is the open conversation part of the conference. So feel free to ask questions to each other.
What I wanted to ask was regarding the project of Jubilee 2000. I know that the 2000, the change of century millennial, was a big date, and therefore I know that there was a big movement especially in England, proposing the elimination and the forgetting of the third world debt, sovereign debt. And I know that that led to nothing, because it's a very prophetic voice announcing to a system that's so corrupt and broken. And I mean, the only debt that I know that has been forgiven was Haiti, and in extraordinary circumstances. If not, it would have been Iceland not being forgotten and forgiven of the debt, but decided not to pay it. But I know that there was a big movement in England in theologians, and if I'm not mistaken, John Stott and his movement. I wanted to ask Chris what his participation in that was, and what his view on that specific moment in time was. But how can we reinvent it now? I mean, the need for Christians to ask for this kind of actions today, and not wait 970 or 80 years for this to happen again.
Thank you. Cheryl may wish to come in on this as well, because the involvement with the Micah Network and some of those organizations like Tear Fund and others were certainly involved in the Jubilee 2000 effort. I mean, it was certainly, I think, spearheaded by Christians, and some of us, wrote articles in some of the magazines that were around at that time, Third Way and others. I don't think I'm entirely as pessimistic as you would suggest. It was taken up even at government level. I know that at the time, Gordon Brown, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, did seek to influence other governments and some of the banks to cancel some of the third world debt. I don't know how far it went. I'm not an economist, and I don't know exactly all what happened, but I think it did have an impact beyond just Haiti. In terms of what we could, what some of us did was to try to help people in the secular world realize, where does this word Jubilee come from? because it was being used. And of course, it's also used in a secular environment. The Queen had a golden jubilee when she'd been on the throne for 50 years, and a diamond jubilee, you know, she was there for 70 or whatever it was. And, so Jubilee gets used in that way, but we tried to help people to see this actually goes back to the biblical roots of Leviticus 25 in order to restore that debt should not be eternal. There should be some release of debt, and that's a biblical principle. What one can do beyond that, I don't know, other than continue to advocate and campaign in relation to debt, even at a local level. I think debt is one of those terribly enslaving things, and the levels of personal indebtedness in addition to sovereign indebtedness is scary, I think, and we haven't really learned the lesson of 2008, and it looks like it could happen again, and the probability is that the banks will get off with it again. I mean, they got off with it already. Almost nobody has been prosecuted for fraud and all the terrible things that happened in 2008. But I don't know whether Cheryl wants to comment from the point of view of any of the organizations in the Micah network that must have participated in Jubilee 2000.
Yeah, and many did, and the motivation, I think, was genuine, because they said that there's no way that a lot of these countries can actually ever get out of the spiral of poverty and dependence on aid unless they're given a chance to start with a clean slate. And that's exactly why it was called Jubilee. So there was a lot of advocacy about that, but there was also a lot of argument whether it should come with conditionality or not, because many people said, well, if you don't tackle the issue of corruption, which is part of the reason why there's debt, then you can clean the slate clean, and then people will continue. So you needed to back it up with clear good governance training, so that the money that was then saved from the debt repayment was put into education and health, etc. And then, of course, people argued that that was becoming like a controlling form of another form of colonialism. And then others said, well, there should be a period of time that the government was given to prove that it was going to change its ways on how it allocated. And it got very messy because, again, like you say, Chris, you can't just tackle the one side, economic, without looking at the political, social, the spiritual. It's also interlinked. And that's where I feel, that comes to my question, which really stimulated me in your book, which was about cross-centered social action. Because the thing that we sometimes fool ourselves as Christians is that because we're Christians, we think we will have the right economic answer or the right political answer for the situation. So we try and think creatively and cleverly within our knowledge of the context. But actually what I think we're missing, and perhaps is where I'd like you to maybe help us, is how do we actually bring a cross-centered discernment into such a situation? So like Andrew was saying about Jubilee and debt, how would we have been distinctively different other than just arguing for a clean slate? I mean, it's quite a tricky one.
It certainly is, and I think two quick comments. One, yes, we do need to keep the cross central, because ultimately we do what we do only because it is a God who forgives all debt, because it was borne by Christ in the cross. So we have a good news message to share at the level of at a spiritual level, which of course is what is in some ways what will bring people out of corruption, is a transformation of the heart and the mind. And the covetousness and greed and so on that generates corruption. That would be my first comment. My second would be, of course, that there's something terribly hypocritical about the West talking about corruption in the majority world, given the horrendous levels of corruption that happen in Washington and in London and in the West. I mean, it's all somewhat sanitized. It may not be quite so blatant. At least not so in your face, but it is massively corrupt. I mean, the way in which favors are bought and sold and political decisions are bought and sold, and the wealth that people make out of being in public and political office, and the nepotism and that is going on right now. We simply have not got any moral high ground left in the so-called Christian West. We're all in this together in terms of the sin and evil of corruption and the debt that then goes with it.
Just interesting for a current example, just for you all to see. At the moment, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salam is from Saudi Arabia, is visiting the UK. And there's a lot of us who protested. In fact, Micah wrote a letter to the government in protest of this visit and in protest of the government's investment of billions of sterling into the arms trade that they're selling to Saudi Arabia for work in Yemen, which is really causing havoc. And when I got an answer from the government back saying why this is justified, they said it is important for us to protect the jobs in the industry of the arms trade, and it is for our economic safety and well-being. And our answer to that, which actually Vinod Ramachandra helped me formulate, was, well, if the gospel has had any impact on our society and our government in the UK, surely there comes a moment when we as a government have to say economic growth or job safety at any cost is not the right way of going. Because at least if our jobs are lost, we have a social welfare system that supports us. But who's going to be the voice for the Yemenis who are being at the rough end and being killed? There's no one speaking out for them. So although we recognize that the government has a very tough choice, surely if the gospel impacts our government, or if we are to impact our government with the gospel and the cross, then we have to say that economic growth at any price is not the way.
Yep. And we were already saying that in relation to the 10 commandments, weren't we, David? The 8th commandment, the 4th commandment, that we are not, our human value is not measured simply by our productivity, that human life is more than just economics. No, I quite agree, Cheryl, and I'm deeply ashamed of our country at the moment in all sorts of ways. That's one of them. There are plenty of others.
Thank you, Cheryl and Chris. I wanted to give the mic to Norman to ask a question. Norman, are you there?
Yes, thanks. As I'm reading the story surrounding the conquest of Canaan, I'm asking myself, and I'm now passing this question to you guys, especially to Chris, why I don't see Israel bringing this fully sense of Exodus-shaped redemption they had experienced by themselves to the another surrounding villages, these other nations. I don't know if you understand.
I do understand it, and it is an important question, and the answer is to some degree they did. The social and economic history of the settlement of Israel in Palestine is very complex. Clearly, they, over a long period, replaced what had been a society highly stratified with small kings, chieftains really, over fortified towns, and the population in kind of serfdom, paying taxes and fighting in the army for their kings. They replaced a system in which the land was owned by a few and the majority were serfs, with an economic system which was different, the Israelite one, in which the land was shared out and held by families. And many of the Canaanites, of course, that resisted the Israelites were either driven out or their fortified towns were destroyed, and so the power base was destroyed. It seems that at least some of the Canaanite population transferred allegiance to the Israelites, and indeed there are some Old Testament scholars who would argue that a fairly large part of the settlement of Israel in Canaan was precisely that, namely a process of more of assimilation into the Israelite tribal system. So the Jebusites, for example, who were the inhabitants of Jerusalem, actually then are adopted as a clan in Judah. The Gibeonites make a rather fallacious treaty with the Israelites, but the Israelites honor it. You have individuals like Rahab who comes over to the Israelites and despaired, and one wonders, was she entirely exceptional, or was this, were there others who did that? So it's a mixed story. On the one hand, there is the destruction of the Canaanites' civilization, portrayed as an act of God's judgment on its degradation and its immorality and their child sacrifice and their oppressive practices. But there's also the beginnings at least of a modeling of something that was a bit more like Old Testament law in terms of the use of land, the distribution of land, and the preservation of land within family kinship units, which we see right through until the 9th century in the story of Naboth and Ahab and the vineyard, when Ahab wants to purchase Naboth's vineyard, and Naboth says, I can't, it belongs to my family, it's not for sale. And Ahab knew that, and so he just goes and sulks and won't eat his breakfast until Jezebel comes in, because Jezebel is Canaanite. She's from Tyre and Sidon, and she says, that's no way to be king. You know, where we come from, kings can take whatever they want. And so she kills Naboth and his family, so the land belongs no longer to them, and then takes it for the crown. And so you get this beginning of a process of almost the Canaanizing again of the Israelite social system, which the prophets then protest about, beginning with Elijah, and then, of course, on through Amos in the 8th century and so on. So it's a somewhat more complex argument historically, but I think theologically and economically, God was wanting to say that the Israelites were to be holy, they were to be different from the surrounding nations, not just religiously, not just by saying, well, we worship Yahweh, you guys worship Baal, but in a complete social system, social, economic, and political system, which would reflect something of God's values, which of course is what we've been looking at in the book of Exodus, in some of the laws in the book of the covenant.
Could I comment on that briefly? Just if you see the biography of Solomon, he is basically the return to a society which is very similar to Egypt, in which the great oppression is established once again. Mm-hmm. But I think that reading in these texts, is really important to discover the connection between a faith and a religion and a cult and daily practices and lives. Then there is the redemptive side of not only individually, but also socially and structurally. We don't see it in our modern societies in such a way because we have been blinded of the social structures, because we interpret the Bible in such an individualistic way that we don't see this. But the establishment of the Jubilee as an example, or all of the laws, or the connection between the Decalogue, between honoring God and the treatment of others, and the establishment of a society and a hierarchy. And if one starts reading in this key, the readings, the argument that Chris was just saying is reinforced over and over and over again until it becomes something that you cannot move away from. The position of the monarchy and the position of the temple and the position of the prophets are all keys in which one sees that the redemptive aspects and of the Exodus, the intention of God was to continue them in time and therefore institutionalize, and this is something that I commented in the chat last session, was the division or tension between a redemptive moment and a redemptive society. The Exodus was a redemptive moment of revolution, and then the establishment of hierarchies and the establishment of, or the lack of hierarchies, but the establishment of institutions that were redemptive, like the Jubilee and the laws and the religion, and the need for the priests to be poor, because therefore they're going to keep the faith or the memory of the right God. And if those priests are not poor, then they're going to forget the God that liberated them and the God that felt the oppression of his people. And therefore, I think that the tension between the moment of liberation in the Exodus and the establishment of a redemptive society is there and is very clear, and one starts seeing the monarchy and the establishment of the temple and the big cities and the big oppression of Solomon not as an exception but as a big shifting away from the desire of God, and therefore one understands the prophets. So I would say that what Chris was saying is strongly emphasized in the prophets, strongly emphasized in the remaining of the Old Testament, and one starts seeing the Bible from a systematic view, or not only from an individualistic view. One takes a couple of passages and takes a moralistic and ethic understanding standing for one individual life, which is the blinding spot for many Christians today in modern societies.
I think part of the blame for that, Andrew, and I entirely agree with you, is in the perhaps the typical way in which the Old Testament is handled and taught, especially in evangelical churches, because we all teach our children the stories of the Old Testament, but we teach them as little moral lessons, you know, be like little boy David, you know, be like Moses, be like Joseph, and they're individualized into here are people you should be like, and here's somebody you shouldn't be like, you know, on the one hand, and or we take the book of Psalms, and again, we take all the bits of the Psalms that we like because they're encouraging or they help us to cope with problems. And we ignore the vast quantity in the Psalms which are dealing precisely with issues of social and economic injustice. And we actually, quite literally, we blank them out. I did this exercise once with a group of students in India. I got them to read one of the Psalms. I can't remember which one it was now, but it was one of the Psalms which was basically a psalm of lament, talking about all the problems and injustice and people, the wicked and the murderers, etc. And then I played to them a worship song based on that psalm. I can't remember who it was now, but it was some worship group that had made a lovely devotional song using words from this psalm. And I said, after they listened to it, and it was all very nice and sweet and whatnot, and I said, so which verses in the psalm in the Bible were not included in the worship song for the church? And of course, it were all the verses about wickedness and injustice and suffering and lament and protest. They'd simply been airbrushed out. And I thought, doesn't that say something? It shows the way in which we have not read the Old Testament as adults, as politically and economically aware people, to see precisely the things that you highlighted there, issues of politics, justice, judges, kings, prophets, governments, international relations, all of those things in there. And actually that begins to answer a question that I'm reading from Tim in the chat section. One of the answers to that is because he raises this issue of
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, sorry, David, do you want to interrupt there?
Yes, sorry. I think Tim's question is very good and appropriate. What I suggest is if you could address that after we talk about the Cape Town commitment bit, just because we have half an hour left. So what I definitely will why don't we come back to Tim's question? But what I wanted to propose now is let's go back to the topic of God's presence among His people, and so that we can draw a bit more theology from that in order to wrap up the conversation with the call to mission, holistic terms, and the people that oppose the concept. So to do that, I hope that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
I wanted to share with you I'm a little bit new on this sharing. Okay, here. Yes. Does everybody see this? The sacred has absorbed the secular. Okay. So Chris shared some documents on the theme of presence, and especially I was drawn to this extract that he shared with us about how the Spirit empowered two artists, Bezalel and Uri. Correct me if that's the wrong way to pronounce those names, but so I just wanted to read that portion as a way to bring us back to the theme of the presence of God. And then in Exodus 31 says, then the Lord said to Moses, see, I have chosen Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Ur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills, to make artistic designs for work in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, and to engage in all kinds of crafts. So it's in his commentary, Chris highlights how what an interesting passage this is, right? Because we're talking about the tabernacle and all this aspect of the cult. but we see the first intervention of the Spirit empowering someone to do something. In this instance of Bezalel, son of Uri, and I wanted to connect that with something that Chris also mentioned about the how the sacred is expected to permeate the whole of society. And he highlights this passage on Zechariah. On that day, holy to the Lord will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, on the cooking pots, and in the Lord's house will be like the sacred bowls in front of the altar. So how everything, all mundane things, are expected or promised to become holy to the Lord. Without reading the entire quote from Spurgeon there about not separating the sacred from the secular, I just wanted to invite Chris to speak more about this, how we can live out this presence of God. And it seems that one of the barriers for doing that is that we have in modern Christianity especially, but bringing it into postmodernity, we begin by dividing the secular from the sacred. So, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, David. Just to remind everybody that paragraph starting "to a man who lives under God" is not me speaking. It's in my commentary, but it's actually a quote from a sermon preached by Charles Haddon Spurgeon in 1874. So it's, but I think it's a great quote because he's obviously drawing from all the imagery he's using there are drawn from the Old Testament. You know, the priest's vestments, the sacraments, the meal, the holy food, the incense, the sacrifices, and so on. And he's saying that all of that, which in the Old Testament was, in a sense, a holy space for God to dwell safely among his people, that has been democratized because the dwelling place of God is now with all of us. Christ has become the tabernacle and the people of God have become God's temple. And so the whole of life as a Christian is lived within the sphere of the sacredness. That's the point of that quote. And just going back to Exodus for a moment, I don't know if I said this last week, I can't remember, but Exodus 19 is a curious chapter because God begins by saying, I brought you to myself. You know, I brought you out of Egypt and I brought you here to myself. I want you to be with me. And then he says, but don't come too close. You know, there's a sort of a pull and a push in that chapter. And then that continues because in chapter 24, the 70 elders and Moses, when they go up the mountain and they eat and they drink in the presence of God, they see God and you know, they have some remarkable experience of God's presence, yet only Moses goes right on up to the top into the actual presence of God. There's something, as it were, both welcoming about the presence of God, but also something dangerous. And so when God says, build me a tent, a tabernacle, and I will dwell with them, I will dwell among them in chapter 25, it's God, as it were, it's almost God's dilemma. You know, God has this quandary. I want to dwell with my people. I want to be in their midst, but they're sinners and they're unholy and they're unclean. So how can that happen? And so God creates this sacred space where his presence will dwell. But he still doesn't then say, okay, I'll sit here in this little tent and you can all go and live any way you want. No, he says, you've got to be a holy people. As holy in a sense as you can be. God says, I've made you holy. I've sanctified you to myself. Now then, here's how I want you to live. And so the ethical dimensions of the Ten Commandments and the books of the law and the book of Deuteronomy are all saying that God's people must seek to live lives that are holy and clean in the ethical way in order for God to dwell among them. But the central chapters there, chapters 32 to 34, when they make the golden calf and they worship idols and so on, we see immediately from that here is a people who, even though Moses received the instructions about how to make the tabernacle, they're off building the golden calf. And they receive God's judgment, but then they also receive God's forgiveness. And then God says, okay, I will dwell with them, I will go with them. But what we realize once we got past Exodus chapter 34 is that God's dwelling with his people is always going to be a matter of God's grace, God's forgiveness. The Israelites walked on the grace of God. They could never claim that somehow their holiness deserved them to be in the presence of God. That is kind of shot right out of the picture by Exodus 32 to 34. And then they build the tabernacle and God's presence fills it. And the Exodus ends with this marvelous experience of the holiness of God and the cloud of God's presence filling the tabernacle. So I wanted to say that. And then I think what David wanted me to do was to kind of connect that presence of God in the midst of his people, which the New Testament, as I say, democratizes. It's God amongst all his people, and we all dwell within that sacred realm, to the Cape Town commitment. And that section that he shared with you, it's part 2E, calling the Church of Christ back to humility, integrity, and simplicity. And you'll see there, particularly sections 3, 4, and 5, walk in humility, rejecting the idolatry of power, walking in integrity, rejecting the idolatry of success, and walk in simplicity, rejecting the idolatry of greed. Just a little bit of background to that. As you know, the Cape Town Commitment was produced in the context of the 3rd Lausanne Congress for World Evangelization in 2010 in Cape Town. And I was, part of the program planning and the theological working group and so on in the years before that. And one of the deep concerns that I had, along with a few other people, some of those who are in my theology group, was that we did not want the Lausanne Congress in Cape Town to become a kind of cheer fest. Look at all this wonderful evangelism that's happening around the world. Look at all this marvelous stuff that God's doing, and it to become a great hurrah, simply a kind of triumphalistic celebration. We wanted to celebrate. Of course we celebrate what God is doing. There's marvelous things to celebrate. But my sense from the scriptures is that when God speaks to his people in the Old Testament, and of course through Jesus and through Paul, the big problem to God is not the world and the idolaters out in the other nations. Of course they're worshipping other gods. God's biggest problem is his own people. And the bulk of the prophets, with some of the exceptions, the oracles against the nation, but the bulk of the prophets are forcing the people to look at themselves and to say, look, we need to come back to God. We need to repent if God is going to be able to use us in his mission, and particularly to repent of idolatry. So my heart was saying, I can't be at Cape Town and not speak about this issue of the need for particularly the global evangelical church, to take a look at itself as the world sees it, and to say, sometimes we just do not look like the Jesus we proclaim. We have the idolatries of greed and the prosperity gospel. We have sexual immorality. We have pastors beating their wives. There's all sorts of ways in which those who name the name of Christ are themselves not living Christ-like, humble lives. So I thought, well, what are the big idols in the Old Testament? And you get these idolatries of power. And already Andrew's been mentioning the Pharaoh complex, the idolatry of empire and power. And that infects the church. It did very quickly in Christendom when the church just took over the appearance of the Roman Empire. And then you get the idolatry of greed. And there's a lot in the prophets about how the priests are serving for money and the prophets are prophesying for money, and the country has gone in the way of extortion, exploitation because of greed. And also the idolatry of image and twisting the truth in order to, well, we were already talking about Facebook, and the way in which we all like to say good things about ourselves. So I thought, if these are the idols, what are the opposites? And that's where I came up with this phrase of we need to return to humility, and integrity and simplicity. And it just happened that in the English language, that creates a nice little acronym, HIS, his. And I said, will we be his people? It was all very clever, you know. Of course, it wouldn't have worked in translation, I'm sure. But anyway, it suited me. But as I've reflected on today and what David asked me to sort of connect that section of the Cape Town commitment, it struck me that humility, integrity, simplicity do relate to some of the 10 commandments and several of the laws in the Old Testament very clearly. Humility, for example, I love the way when David was talking about the commandments, he said that the first 3 commandments, especially the first and the second, de-absolutize all the other idols that we might worship. You know, it says there's one God and one God only, and he is the one you must worship. And once you get that straight, you know, in your life, that he is the God to be worshipped, then not only do other idols fall out of the way, so does yourself, because self is the biggest idol. You know, we make ourselves into idols. And so in a sense, the biggest antidote to the idolatry of worshipping other gods is humility. When you say, no, I'm what God has made me by God's grace. I'm a sinner saved by grace. So let me just be here where God has, and worship the Lord God. So the value of humility in a biblical sense, both Old Testament and of course in the teaching of Jesus and of Paul, connects, I think, very clearly to the first 2 commandments especially. And then integrity, connected to the 9th commandment. And I was pleased to hear David talking about the importance of the integrity of the judicial process. But I think it also applies at a more general level of integrity in personal life, that there's no dichotomy between what you say and what you do, or the image you project and the reality inside, as well, of course, as integrity in our systems. It's a terrible scandal when Christian churches or Christian mission organizations get involved in not just injustice, but, you know, stealing and in lack of integrity and corruption, because it's so contrary to what the Bible teaches with the 9th commandment. And then simplicity, which is the only word I could think of. It's not really the best word, I think, but to express this sense of somehow avoiding the idolatry of covetousness and greed, and the 10th commandment and the 8th commandment. And of course, Paul says, doesn't he, that covetousness is idolatry. Twice he says that. In other words, if you break the 10th commandment, you're effectively breaking the first, because you are choosing to worship that which is not God. So the 10 commandments come around full circle. And the antidote to covetousness is to seek to live simply, and to seek to live with enough. Enough is enough was a famous book some time back. And this was something which, again, I don't claim to have great expertise in, but my mentor, John Stott, was a great advocate of simple lifestyle. There was a whole Lausanne conference on that. He himself lived with great humility and great simplicity, even though he made a lot of money from his books, but he gave it all away and put it into a trust fund. So, David, I don't know if that's sort of what you wanted, but that's where it seems to me these things connect. The holiness of God, but he wants to live among us. But if he's going to live among us, we must be cleansed, obviously, by the blood of Christ. We never deserve him to live among us. But having been cleansed by Christ, we then are being sanctified as we seek to live holy lives. And this is just one of the ways we can do that, with the kind of teaching that's there in part 2 of the Cape Town Commitment.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. To all the things that you said, I just wanted to add that I was very drawn to the fact that this calling to even simplicity has to be empowered by the Spirit. Yeah. And as we talk about God's presence that is manifested in our simplicity, or in our lifestyle and integrity and our holiness, I think the Pentecostals do a good job in bringing this component of we need the power of the Spirit to do these things. And I was just really struck by how you mentioned in the narrative of Exodus 31, these artists, their craft, their mundane jobs are brought to holiness, but it's also, I think you mentioned in your commentary, the other way. It's not that our professions or our skills are holy because we bring them to the tabernacle, to the temple, but they're holy in the other way, in a missional sense. That's the field of action for the Spirit to.
Particularly when you remember that the tabernacle, as you've said, and is there in the notes and everything, was meant to be a reflection of creation. There's a creation link between heaven and earth being united in the Garden of Eden, and then God dwelling in the tabernacle, which brings creation, God into creation, and then the temple being the same, and then the story moving right on to the new creation, the dwelling place of God. So that as we work as redeemed human beings in God's created order, as farmers or agriculturalists or teachers or whatever, in other words, any employment that's in God's creation is in a sense contributing to the beauty of God's temple, which the creation is. So by enhancing and using and beautifying and exploiting in a proper sense God's gifts in creation, we are doing what God wants us to do with his temple. And that will ultimately have value in the new creation, because the kings of the earth will bring their splendor, their glory into the city of God. So this is something which I think that's what Spurgeon was trying to say in his sermon, and there's a lot more in that sermon which is really worth reading. That even the plowman, the cook, the nurse, even he says the galley slave, because he takes it back to Old Testament times. It was Paul who said to slaves in Colossians that it is the Lord Christ you are serving. In fact, that part of that sermon of Spurgeon was a sermon on that text. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. And he says that the galley slave could tug his oar for Jesus. And I loved it. It wasn't an endorsement of slavery, but if even a slave could see their work as being done for the Lord, it transforms the whole concept of what work is in God's creation.
Thank you. I wanted to read out Stephen's question about the treatment of refugee claimants in Israel. And I wanted to mention that question in light of last year's Infinite Forum on refugees. The Start Bediako, you participated in that, right? Was it in Ghana?
Yeah.
So Stephen's question says that there's an issue being reported in the press about Israel trying to forcefully send out the people, refugees, especially from Africa, who are in Israel, who are seeking to be settled in Israel. By treating those people in that way, could you mean that Israel, as a contemporary country, is not valuing the principle of valuing the welfare of strangers? I think it can be applied to any country. So would you like to mention something about Start the Diacono Forum, or about your perspective on refugees?
Well, this is a desperate issue, isn't it? I mean, I would say, as you said, it is an issue for almost all Western countries. I mean, we face it in Britain with refugees and asylum seekers, and even more so in the Mediterranean countries of Italy and Greece, where people are flooding there from the Syrian war and across the Mediterranean from Libya. Massive problem, and it's hard to address it with a combination of the longing to be biblically loving and kind and generous to welcome strangers, with the almost overwhelming reality that the Old Testament law is not envisaging 500,000 refugees coming to your country. And so there is a political issue of proportionality here, which we have to address, which is quite hard. The difficult thing about this one, of course, is that if Israel is doing this, and if Israel wanted to claim, as many Jews would and many Christians would, that somehow it is a fulfillment of prophecy, and they are, the fulfillment of what the Old Testament was saying, or for Jews it wouldn't be the Old Testament, it's their scriptures, then one might want to say, they of all nations ought to know that it is in their very DNA, in their spiritual constitution to do justice to the stranger, to love the stranger. That's there in their commandments. So if they are doing the same as so many Western countries are doing and adopting a very harsh position towards refugees and asylum seekers, it's very difficult to square with the claim to be somehow biblical. Although, of course, the Israeli state, I think, would want to say that they are not biblical. They are a secular state, they would say. They're a secular democracy. But of course, they want to be a secular democracy which is also Jewish. And there's something slightly contradictory about that when it comes to the outworking of it. But that's a big issue. It's a very difficult one. I don't know whether, again, Cheryl is part of the Stop Betty Yaakov Forum, and it is an issue being addressed by various groups around the world, Christian groups around the world.
Yes, and it comes to that question about, where it says in the Great Commission, how do we disciple nations? I mean, how do we instruct and have a prophetic voice to the governments around the world when they are doing exactly what they shouldn't be doing? Yeah. And how do we demonstrate that? I mean, one way, Chris, you're saying it very clearly, we have to, as the Old Testament was concerned about, how do we live distinctively so that people see the difference, the kingdom values coming through. But at the same time, how do we influence and teach governments and or the surrounding communities that don't yet know him? How do we teach and influence? And I think we often are criticizing ourselves and trying to find the right thing. We're trying to send out, short stab statements of protest to governments and to point out the hypocrisy of what they're doing, but actually we don't teach them. So we have these hit and run statements, which we call campaigns. I'm being a bit critical of ourselves at the moment, but I'm just wanting to ask us and to ask you, Chris, to say, well, how would you, when you draw from the Exodus story, and maybe when you look at it, the whole biblical narrative throughout the revelation of God, how do we actually disciple nations ongoing rather than the hit and run, or as we have the Stop Betty Yaakov conference, the Micah consultations, try very hard to revitalize ourselves and to spur ourselves on and to point out the things that are going wrong. But I don't see us really knowing how to actually get into the public square and teach.
I agree with you, and I have to confess I don't know the answer. I mean, in Britain we do have things like the Theos think tank, the Jubilee Centre. There are groups that are trying to produce research and documents that then speak to Christian politicians. We're very blessed in Britain in having some very good Christian politicians, members of parliament in all parties, not just associated with one party, but across the range, which is a healthy thing. And they, some of them do try to do good work, but whether, and when the church speaks, of course, often it gets laughed at or mocked, or, go back to your pulpits, and stay out of politics. So the Archbishop of Canterbury gets that all the time. So I'm not sure what we can do. I mean, I'm only a humble Bible scholar. I try to make a few things available and hope that other people will use them.
Sometimes when you were sharing, it came to my mind the beginning of the book of Exodus. Because, I mean, we have a woman babysitting, an old sister who was babysitting, but not only babysitting, I mean, she was putting her life at risk by babysitting her brother. And we have the midwives, and we also have Zipporah, the wife. So sometimes I think that if how to deal with all these campaigns, maybe teaching the people at home. Yes. Because sometimes the wives and the children would tell things. I mean, it's a really slow process, but sometimes I think that we focus so much on the big things and forget, as Cheryl shared, the integrity of life. Yeah. And something that maybe we don't see much, but maybe in the long term, I don't know.
Well, you mentioned, I mean, all the people you mentioned were women, and that's itself is significant. I think there are about 10 women in the first few chapters of Exodus, one way or another. You have the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who are named.
Yes.
Pharaoh's daughter isn't named. The two midwives are. Miriam even isn't named until later in the story. And there's Moses' mother, and then there's Deborah, and there's the, not Deborah, Zipporah, and the other sisters and so on. So, I mean, there is a strong argument among some developing communities that women are the key to changing a culture, you know, in terms of their role as wives and mothers and so on, and educating women and using women in economic development for loans and all of that. That they're much more likely to be responsible than men are.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. We know that time is a cruel master, but I didn't want to wrap up this this conference and the course in general without paying attention to Tim's question, because I think it's important for the whole outlook towards the biblical narrative and towards mission that we're trying to build together here. So Tim, go ahead.
Thanks. So I've had the chance to read some of Chris's books and the Busan movement documents, and when I read them, they seem conservative in a positive way, but there's definitely a radical element to them. And so I try to understand some of the critique, and one of the critiques seems to be that there's also an argument that there should be more of a distinction between church and individual Christians. That is to say that individual Christians might be called to creation care or elements like social justice, such as that, but that's outside the scope of the church. So one of the quotes I have is that we should view the gospel and its power to save individuals from hell as rather more essential to Christian mission than healing the sick or planting trees. I have another quote that is posted at the bottom there.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, and it refers to Exodus, and the quote is, "The Exodus is clearly picked up in the New Testament as a paradigm of our salvation from slavery to sin, yet it is nowhere picked up as a mandate for Christian political and socioeconomic activism." So I have my response, but I thought better to ask you since I have the opportunity.
Yeah, it's a big issue, Tim, and not a lot of time to address it really. There's a book just recently published by Zondervan called 4 Views of Mission, edited by Jason Sexton, I think, is the editor. But it's in the Zondervan, you know, their counterpoint series, 4 views of this, 4 views of that, or 5. And there's one, 4 Views of Mission, in which I contributed a sort of summary of my position, and the position that you're representing or speaking about there is also represented in that book. And then we sort of argue with each other a bit. So that might help. My very short answer to that is I really do find that this constant pulling apart of what the Bible as a whole seems to hold together is what frustrates me. You know, the fact that, yes, the New Testament relates the Exodus to the ultimate sin solution that God offers through Christ, that on the cross of Christ, God dealt once and for all with the power of sin and death and hell, and dealt it that fatal blow, and then was raised to new life to prove it happened. To then say that somehow means that everything that God had been teaching in the Old Testament era, when the Israelites, as it were under their schoolmaster of the Torah, that we can somehow then relegate all that as unimportant or not contributing to our understanding of mission, seems to me to be very hermeneutically suspect. I just find it difficult. The other thing, I do have difficulty with this distinction between individual Christians and the church. Now, I know what people are saying, and I agree with them. It's not necessarily the role of a local church to, as they say, to love my wife. I'm told to love my wife. The church isn't told to love my wife. You know, that's one of the superficial ways people use it. But the church is, in a sense, the collective of all those who are engaged in the world in their work and their daily life, and who should be doing good stuff, being salt and light and everything else, and engaged in politics and economics and work and so on. But the church is the place in which people come together to be equipped for that dimension of their life. So the church needs in itself to be aware of and to be engaging with those issues. one thing that has helped me a little bit is this. Don't know whether this will help anybody. I don't know whether we've got time for it, David, but you know, I'm British, and I was born after the end of the Second World War, so I have no experience of the Second World War. But if you think of the war, and I'm going to make a sort of analogy to spiritual warfare and to what mission is in a large sense. During the Second World War, there was a national mission. The nation, the British nation and the empire, their war aim was to defeat Nazi Germany, to defeat Hitler. That was the aim, that was the goal. There was a single objective to achieve. Within that overarching mission, there were many missions. Airmen were sent out on missions. Soldiers were sent out on missions. The sailors went out on missions. There was all sorts of ways in which the troops of the nation had to be intentional about engaging the enemy. All right. Now think of the spiritual warfare dimensions of that. But the whole country was living in a war dimension. People would ask, "Don't you know there's a war on?" Everybody's lives were impacted by the fact that the country was at war. So work was affected, the economy was affected, daily life, schools, the lighting. The whole of life took on a wartime dimension for everybody, whether they were soldiers or whatever, all civilians as well. Now, it seems to me that if we take this through to the church, there is a sense in which the church as a whole exists within the spiritual reality of the war of God's mission, that God's ultimate mission is to defeat the enemy, to defeat Satan and death and sin and everything else. And indeed, he's accomplished that already on the cross and the resurrection, but we're still involved in the war. So therefore, the whole church lives with that dimension. It affects everybody's life. Your work life, your home life, your family life is all connected to the fact that we are engaged in that for God. But there are those who are particularly called and sent and commissioned and trained to engage in, quotes, missions in that narrower sense of specific missional intentionality, evangelistic campaigns, social work, development work, creational care, all of those things can have a missional intentionality within the overarching war aim of the church as a whole to participate in the mission of God. So I don't know whether that analogy helps, but it helps me to see a whole together. The mission of God, the mission of the church as a whole, and the missions of individuals to get involved in God's work. Not necessarily the best analogy, but at least it helps to keep hold things together. But that book and some other things I've written might address the issue a bit more clearly.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to everyone. We've gone a little bit over time, but it was very much worthwhile. Again, I hope that this course has been a blessing for you, and it's provided opportunity for a worldwide exposure to missional thinking. And thank you again, Chris, not only for these times in the conference, but for sharing your manuscripts with us. As we wrap up,
could I ask you, David, people just might like to pray for me in that, because I had hoped to finish that commentary by Easter, but I'm pretty sure I won't, because I'm going to India the next 2 weeks to visit my family, my son and daughter-in-law there. But I do want to get that commentary finished by the summer, if I can, and I've still got to do chapters 32 to 34, the next main section, and then it'll be pretty well complete. So, yeah, and it'll be published by Zondervan eventually, probably sometime next year.
Thank you. So I just wanted to leave everybody with this quote, I think, from Chris's book, where there is political injustice, economic exploitation, social oppression, and spiritual bondage. What actions are appropriate for those who share God's passion and justice demonstrated at the Exodus? So this is a lifelong question, which is there. Thank you, Carla. And I hope this course has helped you, encourage you to answer that question in your daily lives and also in the public sphere. We should pray, and especially for Chris. And I would like to ask maybe someone we haven't heard from today. Lovelyn, would you be able to wrap up this time in prayer, and especially pray for deadlines and work that has to be accomplished in the next few weeks?
Yes, I'm happy to pray for us. The reason I've been quiet is just because my washing machine is going on in the background and it's a bit loud. So if you hear it, please excuse me. Juggling a lot of things today. Yeah, but let's pray. Let us pray. Jesus, we thank you that we can come before you. Thank you for the opportunity to break bread together and to, really fill up each other's souls and to learn from each other. Thank you for the blessing that this course has been, for challenging some of our theologies, for enriching our theologies, but I guess, Lord, most importantly, for drawing us closer to you and to each other. So God, I just want to thank you for that. And I pray, God, that, even as the course itself comes to an end, I pray that this journey of inquiry, God, into the words that you've spoken to us, that journey doesn't end after this course. But I thank you for the opportunity that we'll continue to learn and interrogate, and share this with each other. God, I also just want to bring Chris before you. Thank you, God, that he has been so generous with sharing his work, sharing what's on his heart, sharing the gift that you've given him. And God, I just pray that in the time ahead with all the deadlines that he's got, Lord, I thank you that you will really enable him to get through what he needs to get through in this time, God. And even though for him it might feel like a bit of a delay or as if he's not making his deadlines, we trust, God, that in that time, Lord, you're actually refining the commentary that he might have. You're refining the work and the insights that you've given him, for him to put that on paper. So we thank you, Lord, that everything is through you, Lord, and that even the work that he's doing is for you ultimately. So we trust, God, that you'll just empower him to get to the end of that process, God. And thank you for each and every person that's been on this call. Thank you for David and Carla who have organized and put it together. And we just pray your blessing over each and every one of us. In Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank
Wonderful
you.
to meet you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Great. Take care. Bye.